The 2022 Ontario election campaign has come to a close with the Ontario Liberal Party winning one additional seat from what they won in the 2018 election. Joining me now to discuss and reflect on the campaign, what they wish they could have perhaps done differently, and what they are most proud of in their campaigns, is Greg Dempsey, who ran as the Ontario Liberal Party candidate in Peterborough-Kawartha, Elizabeth Mendes, who ran as the party's candidate in Mississauga-Lakeshore, Jerry Levitan, who ran as the party's candidate in the riding of Davenport, and joining me here in studio is Amber Bowen, candidate in the riding of Ajax. Amber, I'll start out with you. You ran again as the party's candidate in the riding of Ajax, so obviously I'm sure there's lots of things that you could look back and reflect on, perhaps things that you wish you had done differently in the election, or things that you were most proud of. I guess just generally speaking, what are some of the things that made you most proud in the election, and what are some of the things that, you know, if it was possible to go back, you perhaps would have done differently?
Well, I come from the labor movement, and one of the biggest things that we always say in labor is that we don't mourn, we organize. And that's absolutely what I'm going to continue to do between now and 2026. We're going to organize. One of the things that I'm so grateful for, being able to have the opportunity to run this campaign in Ajax, was the thousands of amazing conversations I had with people across the town where I live with my family. The one thing that I think that as a campaign we could have done better, we were running as a campaign for 2 years on the ground, making phone calls. When I was just a candidate, I would literally go through the phone book, and yes, there are still phone books, you can find them, to call residents to say, I'm your candidate, I'm trying to be your candidate here in Ajax. What do you need? What do you want from your government? So, I'm very proud of the things that we did and the outreach we had. What I would love to do better is I think we can tighten up our GOTV. And I think that's the one thing we took from this about, how to tighten up some of those little minute details on the campaign trail.
And Greg, perhaps I'll go to you next. You ran in Peterborough-Kawartha, which is often known as a bellwether riding. Whichever party wins government generally seems to win the riding of Peterborough-Kawartha. What were you, I guess, kind of hearing on the doors when you went to the residents of Peterborough-Kawartha and you spoke with them regarding their concerns?
Yeah, it turns out to be still a bellwether. I'm really grateful to be here. I think I'm incredibly proud of the campaign that we ran locally, proud of my team. We did amazing work. Like Amber, I was running for 2 full years before the actual election campaign. And we did pretty amazing things, and we came actually really close to winning in a bellwether in a election that, of course, was not terribly close. And so kudos to my team and all the work that they did. You asked what I was hearing at the doors. I think, first of all, another election, ? That certainly resonated with a lot of people. People were tired of hearing about politics. I think that helped the Doug Ford government a lot. And then people were worried about housing, about affordability, about the cost of everything. And we had some good plans, I think, for affordability. But at the end of the day, it just wasn't quite enough to resonate with those voters.
Elizabeth, I want to go and ask you a question on, Greg mentioned some of the things that he was hearing was about there being another election campaign. Obviously, the last election campaign, other than this provincial campaign, would have been the federal election in September of 2021. And I've heard this from some people that I've spoken with, that there was some concern, I guess, regarding the federal side of things and how that was playing into the election campaign. Did you hear any of that on, when you were door knocking in Mississauga-Lakeshore, of people, say, concerned of the federal side and the impact it was having provincially?
100%. I also, like my colleagues, both Amber and Greg, have been at this for 2 years and consistently knocking on doors since they really led us after COVID in July of 2021. And so it was interesting because we stopped because we were getting confusion because the federal election was coming, and then we started again in October, and the team really hit the ground running post the federal election. And at first it was a lot of confusion, and I think that confusion kind of continued. And unfortunately, I do think that a lot of Ontarians do mix up their levels of government, provincial and federal. And I felt like a lot of times we were told told at the doors that, the brand is hurting, both I think federally and provincially. And unfortunately, there was a lot of conflation of the two. And I think to Greg's point, people were tired. It was another election in 6 months later. And it's been a really long 2.5 years of government consistently talking to people and people listening to a lot, whether it's, pandemic restrictions, whether it was to do with, the pandemic and how we're going to kind of get through it. And I think people were just tired, and it was May and the sun was coming out, and people just wanted to have time to just not spend thinking about politics. But with that said, I am so proud of my team too. Just to your first question, Wyatt, we built our team from ground up. We had so many new people, so many new volunteers. Every single person on my team was their first experience in politics, and they loved it. And they put everything into it. And there was nothing we could have done more on a local level. And I'm just so proud of them for it.
Jerry, on kind of that same point, to what extent were you looking back at the campaign with things that you could have done differently versus what you're proud of in the campaign, and also maybe touch on that difference between federal and provincial? How much did you hear about that one knocking on the streets of Davenport?
Here's my perspective on this. I know that there was not a lot much more I could have done on my campaign. Just like the other candidates, I had a great team. I had a great group of diverse and young volunteers, and they were growing. I was lucky to have a great campaign manager and some senior people with me and raise the funds I needed. But the reality is, a candidate, generally speaking, has a pretty small percentage impact on winning their riding, and the message comes from the top. And the bottom line is this: for those of us, and we're on the screen now, all of us here worked very hard. We had good teams, and we got a great response from the people who wanted to give a response. The reality is, the Liberals did not make their case to the Ontario public, and that's the bottom line. And we can't escape the reality that it was the lowest turnout in Ontario history. That happened for a reason, and it wasn't just the Liberals' fault. Basically, we have a status quo result of what happened before, and I'm sure my friends on the Zoom will say the same thing. People were asking me at the door, they were saying, okay, so why are we voting for you? Like, what is the message? And from my perspective, we didn't have a coherent and clear, uniform pitch as to why the Liberals should win as opposed to the NDP or the Conservatives. And to answer your second question, got that at the door, and about the federal election and another election, but it's not an excuse. We live in a democracy in a world where we're watching, and Greg can speak of this given his experience at the United Nations, a world that democratic institutions and governments and societies are disintegrating. And here in Ontario, we had an election, the lowest turnout in our history. What is happening? That's the question I think we have to ask. And the only way to overcome that is for a party and a leader to have a coherent, clear message as to why people should vote for them and what they're going to accomplish.
And Amber, looking back on the election campaign itself, obviously, as you mentioned before, there are some things that you were proud of, some things that you ideally would have done differently. But on that, piece, oftentimes we hear about the federal versus provincial, and I saw a couple of interviews that have been done after the election on various news outlets, and I've heard this question time and time again. Would you have wanted, based off of the branding that the Liberal Party provincially and federally, would you have wanted someone from the federal side to campaign with you, and what kind of an impact would that have had?
I think that we, we did have, we did have visits from my federal counterpart in Ajax. He was a great person when I asked for advice to get an understanding of, what's happening in Ajax, to kind of understand that piece. But I don't think that any federal intervention would have changed the dynamics for us in Ajax. I think that we had some serious deficiencies and some sort of lack of real clear plans, just sort of like Jerry said about, we didn't message as strongly as we probably could have. I know my counterpart in Ajax had visits from all sorts of visitors from the federal and provincial party to help out there in Ajax, and still we're not quite sure who that candidate is in Ajax that won. So I don't think that was really going to weigh in. I think that we as the Ontario Liberals have to make sure that we are coming across in the next 4 years with a policy that really defines what we are as Ontario Liberals, and make sure that is a clearly communicated plan that comes out from day one out of the gate. And I think that that's what will make the difference coming forward in the next 4 years.
And Greg, just before I go to you, just to kind of follow up with that, Amber, to what extent do you think that once a new leader is chosen on the provincial side, obviously, will that make a difference in the next campaign? And would it have mattered who the leader was in this campaign to, I guess, base it off of your performance? Or do you think it's still just people may have the past in their minds of the Ontario, or what do you think ultimately led to only 8 seats being won for the party?
There's a lot of things that make that up. I will tell you that in getting to know Stephen Del Duca over this past 2 years, I'm in awe of his presence. I'm in awe of his plans. I'm in awe of his integrity. And I think that as we go forward looking at a new leader, there's a lot of work to be done in the party. We have to find the things that will reignite Ontarians. And the Ontario Liberal Party is a huge tent. And the cool thing about that cool tent is that in that tent, there's room for Labor Liberals like myself. There's room for, blue Liberals. There's room for many people of different ethnicities, of different genders, of different parts of Ontario. But what we all have in common is the hope and the inspiration to do better. And I think that that's what's going to need to be more pervasive going forward. So I think I'm grateful for Stephen Del Duca's leadership. I was happy and proud to be a member of his caucus alongside these fantastic candidates that I see on the screen and the ones that aren't here today. So, I think that it really just comes down to what was going on with Ford at the time was really the critical piece this time. And we know that we can do a lot better.
And Greg, obviously looking at the future of the Ontario Liberal Party, given Stephen Del Duca's resignation, one major part of the future of the party will be, first of all, choosing an interim leader and then obviously choosing a permanent leader. What characteristics does that next leader need to have to build on the performance in this election and ultimately win government, which is what the party would obviously want?
Yeah, so I want to echo what Amber said. I think that Stephen Del Duca did a great job of running the party, was a very hard worker behind the scenes and deserves a lot of kudos for that. I think what we lacked really was a big idea, because the value proposition of the Ontario Liberal Party was always that we are good, solid managers of Ontario. And I think the pandemic gave Doug Ford and his government that aura of managing Ontario well.